Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Sia, titled 1000 Forms of Fear. You know, the more I think about it, the less I think that anyone should be surprised whatsoever that Sia's career trajectory went the way that it did. See, while the mainstream lately became acquainted with Sia thanks to her appearances on Flo Rida's Wild Ones or David Guetta's Titanium, or from the noted songwriting credits that she has scattered all over the pop landscape over the past couple of years, Sia's been around for a fair bit longer in the indie pop scene with a selection of albums that were reasonably well received, if not exactly critically acclaimed. Her original selection of material started in the vein of down-tempo R&B, which was a really brilliant fit for her solid melodic compositions, her very emotive, subtle delivery, and her underwritten songs that worked more on emotive presence than on lyrical description. Now, those of you who have any grasp of my own personal taste by now likely think that the latter would mean that I'm never really much of a fan of hers, but that material did work for me in the same way that I liked, say, Rye, for instance. It was subtle, it was understated, and it was powerfully vulnerable. In other words, it was extremely effective down-tempo R&B. I really liked it. And yet, Sia did not stay in this way, as she began pushing her sound towards more of the quirky, flashy, borderline twee side of the indie pop that I have a really hard time liking. Now, sure, there was some subversive darkness that still crept into her lyrics, but it wasn't as good of a fit for her newer sound, especially when it came to some of the actual poetry behind her words. What it was a solid fit for was the rise of the bombastic EDM-flavored pop that in the vein of David Guetta, which didn't rely so much on lyrics as it did on raw feeling and emotive presence, which is a good fit for Sia. And sure, Sia had always had this, but with the underwritten lyrics, the thinner emotional framework that comes with some of that EDM, especially from David Guetta, and her tendency to work with producers and artists who just could not match her level of subtlety and expressiveness, it started becoming into a bit of an issue with me. On top of that, you could always recognize a song written by Sia by any other artist. And while Sia could make her brand of songwriting work for herself fairly consistently, it didn't exactly translate for singers like Rihanna all that well. But oddly enough, the prospect of the flash of fame was something that Sia found profoundly uncomfortable, leading to a drug and alcohol abuse and nearly a suicide attempt. Instead, she decided to focus on writing songs for other people, and only signed with RCA for a major label record on the condition that she didn't have to do any touring or any press appearances, which led to this album, 1000 Forms of Fear. And even though I wasn't really the biggest fan of Sia going into this album, I knew that her brand of confessional songwriting would at least make for some interesting music given her past experiences. So, what did I discover? Okay, this is a bit of an odd case, because it involves something I don't normally talk about when I discuss pop music. Lyrical restraint. Because while I have issues with this album with regards to production and instrumentation and vocals, my biggest issue falls into this particular category, and it makes what could have been a pretty decent pop album significantly harder for me to like. As it is, Sia's 1000 Forms of Fear, it's okay, I guess, for what it's trying to be, but it also shows an artist caught between two worlds, and that gives this album a distinctly awkward feeling for me all around. It just did not play well with me. So okay, let me explain with the most simple example first, the instrumentation and the production. Now, the majority of the production was handled by Greg Kurstin on this album, who's made quite a name for himself over the past couple of years with a certain percussion-heavy, booming production, most notably on Lyrical Lee's most recent album, I Never Learned, which at first seems to have a lot in common musically with Sia's 1000 Forms of Fear. Echoing, booming percussion with an excess of keyboards, vocalists with slightly unconventional voices and a natural gift for melody, and overall a sonic palette that can come across as astoundingly bleak and heavy and dark. And for the most part, it actually does kind of fit the dramatic lyrical themes that Sia is approaching with this album. But at the same time, it doesn't stick with me nearly as well as what happened with Lyrical Lee. And unfortunately, the reason's pretty simple to point out. The production balance is, once again, skewed so heavily in favor of the percussion over the melody, and that used to be one of Sia's strongest assets, and yet it's frequently muted and downplayed, which is honestly a damn shame because there are some pretty strong melodies on this record. The piano lines on Big Girls Cry and Dressed in Black and on Straight for the Knife, they all stand out for me. And I do think that some of the strings arrangements, they could have been promising, like on Cellophane and Fair Game, but the percussion and heavy reverb is always the main focus. And it doesn't help matters that some of the melodies that she does provide aren't exactly all that original. Hostage is probably the track most reminiscent of Sia's last album and her earlier work, then I could swear that that melody was cribbed from a pop country song from the mid to late 90s. And Fire Meets Gasoline, its chorus at least, sounds distressingly like Beyonce's Halo. It just became distracting for me. Now granted, most of these driving melodies for the actual songs are comprised by Sia's multi-tracked vocals, of which I can confidently say you're not going to hear many people sound like her on mainstream radio. Her voice is naturally powerful and is capable of showing a lot of dramatic emotion, but at the same time, I'm not quite sure this brand of pop vocals plays to her strengths. The thing is that Sia's always been capable of vocals that are very subtle and very raw and emotionally effective, and this record does not do subtle. And sure, pop music doesn't have to be subtle, I get that, but you can tell that Sia is pushing her vocals to the absolute limit, and there are points where she's definitely over-singing to the point where her voice cracks or just goes off tune, and it just becomes almost unnecessarily exaggerated at points. And that's not even touching on whenever pitch correction comes in, like on Chandelier. It just sounds plastered on and really unflattering with her vocal tone. Now, the one emotion that definitely springs to mind when it comes to some of her vocals when hearing this record, as a matter of fact, is discomfort. And you know what, to be fair, I get the feeling that that might have been part of the point for a couple of the songs, as a fair few songs do address her issues with fame and being that pop star figure in which she intensely does not want to be. Chandelier, for instance, it's a harrowing song about that party girl losing control, and Cellophane and Dressed in Black both confront her issues with identity and her struggles with suicidal thoughts. That's some pretty potent stuff, but let's be honest, really, most of this album falls into the realm of Sia's typical pop songs that she writes. Vulnerable songs about relationships that are either in trouble or are broken altogether, self-esteem anthems, and even a few of Sia's unconventional brand of sex jams like on Eye the Needle or Free the Animal. Hell, Straight for the Knife almost plays like a straight-up noir murder ballad that in the vein of a Lana Del Rey song done right. Granted, I still prefer Sharon Van Etten's Your Love Is Killing Me, which is really the best example of how to do the song right this year, but you know what? This song's a close second. It's not bad, but here's where we run into my big issue with this record. Even for pop music, there's no lyrical restraint on this album. The metaphors are very big and broad. The symbolism is very vividly sketched. It's very clear that large chunks of this album, they're not meant to be taken literally, obviously. And thankfully that Sia has the soul and power and intellect in her vocals and in her instrumentation to mostly back up what she's bringing to the table. But there are many points where the lyrics and poetry on this record get so hyperbolic, where the language is so overheated and overwrought that just becomes hard for me to take it remotely seriously. I mean, take Hostage, for instance. It takes a lot of prisoner descriptions and some of its symbolism and uses this as a symbol of heated passion, and it starts looking less like love and more like Stockholm Syndrome. And then Fire Meet Gasoline is positively pyrotechnic, quite literally. But the worst example of this is Free the Animal. And yes, I know, I get the point of the language is to capture those extreme feelings and the heated passion. But when your chorus goes, detonate me, shoot me like a cannonball, granulate me, kill me like an animal, decapitate me, hit me like a baseball, emancipate me, free the animal, it's so hyperbolic that I just can't buy into it. As I said, there's very little subtlety on this record, and while pop music can work by going broad, this is so hyperbolic that I just can't connect with it whatsoever. It doesn't have that human spark for me in some of these songs. And it's a real disconnect here between Sia's very human, very impassioned delivery and the over-the-top lyrics just completely shoves me out of the music. And you know, if it was trying to be silly by going over the top, it could work, but Sia is playing it all very straight. With a record like this, you run into the worst possible result. The exaggeration just ends up becoming kind of mundane and bland by the end, and the lack of real color and flair in the production only emphasizes that further, which was real depressing for me. So you know what, in the end, this record really does feel like the worst possible step from Sia from her older material and for her songwriting. Overwrought and desperately hammering for drama to the point of almost self-parody, which is really quite sad because Sia does not need to overstretch herself in her vocals like this and in her songwriting. Now, some people have made the argument that Sia has spent so much time writing songs for other people that she no longer knows how to really write for herself and her own distinctive identity. But I don't quite buy that. Hell, there are moments like Big Girls Cry and Straight for the Knife where I definitely see shots of that nuance that used to define her work. But for most of this album, Sia broadens her style both in her vocal delivery and in her lyrics so widely that the individual spark and flavor that used to define her material seems a lot weaker for me. And the more conventional production and instrumentation that only seems to emphasize its bleakness weakness really does not help matters or change that. And the worst part of all is that she doesn't not sound comfortable on some of these tracks for me. It just sounds a little awkward. So you know what? I'm giving this album a 5 out of 10, and I really can't recommend it, especially not over her older work. If you're interested, check out those records, but this album, 1,000 Forms of Fear, it sounds compromised to me. And that's the last thing I want to see on records showing this much raw emotion. I want to like it, but no, sorry, not working for me. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Tomorrow is going to be the album that you've all been waiting for, the album that you chose in your votes that you want me to cover. What's it going to be? Well, stay tuned and find out. If there's any other albums coming out this year that you'd like me to take a look at, or there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.